Well, good morning, those of you who are in Mongolia, and good evening. Well, there's a few who are in America, and welcome to another new episode of Virtual Speaker Series with American Mongolian Studies. Today we have as our guest Bill Bikales. Did I say your name correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I will move on to your biography. So Bill is an economist whose work focuses on economic and social development in China and Mongolia, in each of which he has served in senior advisory positions, including in Mongolia, work as an advisor to the Mongolian Prime Minister's office from 1995 to 2001, and a recent stint as the lead economist in the Office of the United Nations Resident Coordinator in China, in addition to earlier senior posts in China for UNICEF, that is the United Nations Children's Fund, and UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. He has also held long-term positions in Ukraine and Philippines, where he served for 3 years as Southeast Asia Principal Economist at the Asian Development Bank. He is currently working on a multi-sectoral assessment of post-communist Mongolia's transition to a market economy and continuing his research into fresh perspectives on China's poverty alleviation challenge. And today, Bill is going to talk to us about the myth of Mongolian shock therapy. Now, some of us, those of us who are not initiated, will not know what a shock therapy is. It almost sounds like something akin to like 1960s and 70s psychotherapist practices, but this is an economic term. Bill, why don't you tell us more about it? I will mute my microphone so that I'm not, so that noises are not coming in. Okay, please share your screen too.
Thank you, Boyan, and good morning to everyone, or good evening, wherever you may be. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, although I wish very much I could be presenting in person. I will start my PowerPoint now, and Boyan, could you confirm my share screen function is acting a little strangely? Do you see the PowerPoint now?
No, we can't see it.
Wait, no, how about now?
It is, oh, we can see it now.
Okay.
Take the reins.
Thank you. So my topic today is what I call the myth of Mongolian shock therapy. A quick note here. Right. Okay. In general, I should say I don't read my slides except for certain portions of them. So my hope is that you will be able to read the slides as I'm speaking, and I will comment on them or highlight some specific points in the slides. But this one I will pretty much read. So the purpose of my talk today is not to get involved in an old and often very heated debate between shock therapy versus more gradual reforms in a transition setting. That was a big topic in the 1990s and 2000s. Some people are still passionate about it today. But I'm not, I'm going to be careful not to be judging anyone here, which approaches were better, which were worse. My purpose is simply to describe what happened as accurately as I can. And relatedly, my purpose is not to critique the role of foreign aid or the international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank in Mongolia or globally. An interesting discussion too, but again, that's not the purpose today. The purpose today is to debunk a view of Mongolia's transition that is demonstrably and deeply inaccurate, and yet it's still widespread. I'm amazed to find how widespread it is, and it still seems to be, it's being promoted still. So what is that myth? So here's what I call the Mongolian shock therapy myth. The myth goes like this. Starting in 1990, the IFIs imposed neoliberal shock therapy on Mongolia with disastrous results that caused terrible hardships for the Mongolian people for many years. As I said, you see this everywhere. You see people saying this, and they generally state it just flat out without any evidence, as though it's a well-proven fact. Usually they say it because they heard someone else say it, and that person heard someone else say it. And very few people actually go back to see what actually happened when Mongolia started its transition to a market economy. So this myth, as worded here, is common, but it is false from start to finish. Every piece of that sentence at the top of the screen is demonstrably false. I'm not denying, nor could I ever, that the Mongolian people suffered a great social and economic shock in the early 1990s. What's wrong about that statement is its description of the origin of the crisis, its impact, and the role of the IFIs. So, as Boyan asked, what do we mean by shock therapy in the economic sense? Basically, starting in the late 1980s, and especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, a whole slew of countries, 25 or 30, started a transition from a planned to a market economy. Transitioning from planned to market included a number of common reforms that basically all of them went through one way or another. Privatization, price liberalization and adjustments, liberalization of trade, stabilization macroeconomically. Everyone went through that, whether it's China or Mongolia or Poland or Russia. All the transition countries did that. But shock therapy is a quite vivid term for one specific approach. And it's also something bad. And that is that it was done by leaders who believed that all these reforms needed to be done as quickly as possible and as comprehensively as possible. So simultaneous privatization, liberalization, and so on. And classic examples were the reform program in Poland under Balcerowicz, the Yeltsin-Gaidar reform program in Russia, the reforms in Estonia, and some others. There's a small group of countries that are known as the ones that tried shock therapy. And our first question today will be, was Mongolia one of them? Is Mongolia a shock therapy country? This slide is clear. It's regarding my own work in Mongolia, so you know where I'm coming from. I did spend 6 months here, my first visit in 1991, on behalf of Jeff Sachs. And Jeff is closely associated with shock therapy in transition economies. Then I came back in 1993, and I ended up spending 8 years The first two were working for the Harvard Institute for International Development. Jeff Sachs later ran that institute, but he did not when I worked for them. I worked at the time under Dwight Perkins, who was also my dissertation advisor. And Dwight was a China expert that I worked very closely and was and still is a China expert. For that time, I worked as economic advisor during the government of Prime Minister Jasrai. I worked as advisor to the National Development Board, which was the former State Planning Commission. And then from 1995 to 2001, as Brian already mentioned, I worked as economic advisor to the Office of the Prime Minister, funded by USAID, the United States government economic development agency. And during those 6 years, politics being what they are, I actually worked for 6 different prime ministers, starting with Mr. Justwright and all the way up through Prime Minister Enkpire. Key sources for today's analysis. I've relied on, in addition to just the data that comes from the usual sources, I've relied on papers from economists who were in Mongolia during those years and who observed the whole transition process. They're listed here. Hiroshi Ueno was a Japanese economist. I just called him a skeptic. He was certainly a skeptic about any sort of radical reforms, as were Peter Morrell, George Corson, and their colleagues from the University of Maryland. Then I also have looked at the writings of Peter Boone, who was sort of associated with Jeff Sachs and quite an advocate for radical, rapid reforms, early IFI reports. And I'll share some personal recollections of mine. Back to the myth. I wanted just to show what I'm talking about. Here are 2 recent examples of the myth. The first one is from Morris Rasabi, professor at Queens College in New York City. Morris is probably the one who's most associated with this shock therapy myth that I am talking about. And here's one passage from a piece of his, which is sort of typical of much of what he said. And if you look at the highlighted section, and he describes what happened after 1990, the West prescribed shock therapy, which involved immediate privatization, minimizing the government, prohibiting subsidies, balancing the budget, liberalizing, and so on and so on. You can read them. And for Mongolia, these policies were a disaster. This has been a theme of Morris's commentary on Mongolia for quite some time. In 2020, Aubrey Menard, I don't know her, a young American scholar, 25 years after the transition started, she stated in an interview in a magazine, you can see, including the highlighted line, so-called shock therapy reforms that had been introduced by Western financial institutions quickly led to widespread suffering and wealth inequality. So that's the myth. Again, that's what I described earlier, and these are 2 examples of people saying it. And the point of today's talk is the reality is the following. That yes, Mongolia absolutely suffered a huge shock, and the cause of the shock was the end of Soviet support and the collapse of socialist bloc soft currency denominated trade. Second, no, Mongolia did not undergo shock therapy the way it's defined commonly. In late 1990 and the first half of 91, there was a brief attempt to do something like shock therapy. But the reforms that were launched then were only partially implemented and then slowed down very quickly. And then they slowed down even further after 1992, when Prime Minister Jasrai took office. The most basic reform, price liberalization, took 6 years to implement. all these things. This is not shock therapy. This is will describe the pattern itself. Thirdly, to the extent that there was something like a Big Bang, it was a Mongolian initiative. It was not imposed by the IFIs in any way. The key measures were prepared and promoted by a group of Mongolian market reform advocates around then Deputy Prime Minister Dagambolt, and even before any IFI agreements were signed. In fact, fourthly, IFIs consistently opposed too rapid a reform timetable in Mongolia. They supported a transition to a market economy, of course. Their reports were all called Mongolia's transition, Mongolia seeking a market economy. They talked about privatization. They talked about all of these things. That doesn't mean that they were pushing shock therapy. And lastly, whatever you think about shock therapy, Mongolia's development since 1990 has not been disastrous, although there have been many painful times. And all in all, it's been quite impressive. Okay. To understand what the history of what happened, first you have to understand what the Mongolian economy was like in 1989. Soviet credits to Mongolia in the second half of the 1980s averaged roughly 30% of GDP per year. This is for many years in the second half of the 1980s. That's a staggering figure. That meant Mongolia's economy, society were staggeringly dependent on support from the Soviet Union. Most of those supports were done as credits, which went into the Mongolian government budget. The Mongolian budget, as in 1989, expenditures equaled 65% of GDP, with a deficit of 20% of GDP. Those are also staggering numbers, only sustainable when the support is being given to you. To save time, I'll move ahead. This is also a key point. In 1989, 90% of Mongolian exports and 94% of imports were denominated in transferable rubles, the ultimate soft currency. Those of you who are young enough that you were not old or born or grown up at the time I'm describing probably don't even know what the phrase soft currency means. But at that time, this was a very big part of people's lives. There was soft currency, meaning rubles, meaning the tugrik, meaning ones that you couldn't use to buy the dollars or yen or Deutschmarks or others. And then those were the hard currency. The soft currency, hard currency distinction is something from history. And this last point is also important. Mongolia's dependence on soft currency trade was higher than that of any Central and Eastern European country. In 1989, only 1% of Mongolia's hard currency exports were less than 1% of GDP. Bulgaria's were 30%, and that was the least of all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. In 1990, that massive Soviet economic assistance was sharply cut, and in 1991, it ended abruptly, 30% of GDP per year. In addition to the loss of the assistance, there were Soviet bloc managers and advisors in factories with the government, in the Nigdels, in the countryside. There were tens of thousands, at times up as many as 100,000 Soviet troops, to one extent or another, spending money and contributing to the economy. They were all withdrawn. Also, critically, on January 1st, soft currency trade was abolished. Mongolia lost the markets for 90% of its exports, and suddenly ports, fuel, medicine, foodstuffs, parts for factories had to be purchased with hard currency, not with soft currency any longer. And Mongolia did not have hard currencies. Sorry, I see someone has raised hand. I've saved for questions at the end. So please bear with me. So these arrangements, this huge shock happened abruptly as of 1990 and 1991, and the shock spread through the whole economy. And you can see from the data, in 1990, GDP started to fall and imports plunged more than 50%. And then imports fell by another 50% in 1991. The loss of those imports was a huge blow to the economy and to people's lives. So how did that shock manifest itself? Well, in January of 91, rationing of key consumer goods started suddenly. Meat, flour, bread, vodka, even, I mean, other goods, tea were rationed because the system was collapsing. In the first 10 months of those years, Mongolia received no Soviet credits and no IFI support. And in 1991, GDP fell by roughly 10%. And poverty now emerged for the first time as a serious problem. This was a huge shock, greater than the Great Depression, greater than any normal recession or depression. It's comparable only to the damage and the losses caused in a war. And the point here is twofold. The cause of the shock was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of its Soviet aid, the end of soft currency trade. And in that face of that situation, there was no painless option available to Mongolia. This was the context in which the IFIs came and other Western donors. There was a huge humanitarian crisis unfolding in Mongolia due to the abrupt collapse of the old system. Next question. So that was the first part. Why I say the first part of that statement was false. That yes, there was a huge shock, but it was not imposed on Mongolia by the IFIs. It preceded the beginning of IFI work. Second, did Mongolia undergo shock therapy? And interestingly, Peter Morrell and Peter Boone, two of my main sources, although they disagreed deeply on the desirability of a Big Bang, Morrell was a big opponent of them. He said, you need to take all sorts of things into consideration. It takes time to set up a market economy. Peter Boone tended to support the idea of you need a rapid, comprehensive reform. Both of them agreed on the following description of how reforms evolved, how they played out in Mongolia. The pattern was this. Very ambitious, even radical reforms were announced, maybe even resolutions issued to implement them, but they lacked political support. And there was not the political support, there was not the plan, there was not the needed infrastructure, policy infrastructure, and to implement the reforms. And there were intense internal battles after they'd been announced. So the pattern was a radical reform was announced at the start of the transition, but actually implementing them took much longer than could be considered shock therapy. So this pattern started in 1990 and 1991 when some figures from the Democratic Progressive Party under Prime Deputy PM Gombold attempted to launch a sort of a Big Bang reform. They were able to draft the agenda, they were able to get it approved, but once it was actually launched, they quickly fell back. They faltered. And that's best understood with some specific examples. So let's look at the most frequently discussed reform, or one of them, and that is price liberalization. So in January 1991, Resolution 20 was issued. This was a huge shock to Mongolian people. If people, in my mind, when people think of shock therapy, this is what they think of, what happened with Resolution 20. What did Resolution 20 do? All fixed prices were doubled overnight. Whoa, that's a tremendous shock to people's lives. It also said that whereas previously there had been 200 prices that were controlled, now there would be only 35 categories of those prices. And then most of those were on paper liberalized in the following year. But this is critical. Although on paper they were liberalized, in fact, immediately after Resolution 20, read the Peter Morel quote here. Government resolutions, individual politicians, ministries, and so on, local authorities and police were all involved in continuing price controls. Data showed that for the prices that were officially decontrolled, 68% in Ulaanbaatar and 75% in rural areas showed no changes at all in the first 8 months after decontrol. What happened was local price commissions were established, including in Ulaanbaatar. There was a very powerful Ulaanbaatar price commission under the city government. And what emerged then was a classic planned economy situation, not a market, let alone a shock therapy type situation, where there were some goods for sale in stores at the official fixed prices. But if you needed to buy more or quickly or regularly, you very frequently had to buy outside of those stores for market prices, much higher prices. So if you wanted to get more meat than the amount that was rationed and that you could get in the official stores, you would have to pay much higher prices on markets outside. And that was true for other goods. That's a classic planned economy situation. There are the official priced goods, which you can obtain if you're lucky. And then there are the market prices, which are much higher. This is not to deny that inflation was high and was a problem for people. You can see here, in 1992, inflation was 321%. That's a very traumatic experience for people, such high inflation. But what's important to note is high inflation was a feature of the economies in all the transition countries, not only shock therapy ones. And this table here is one of the most important ones in the presentation today and worth taking a close look at. It shows, I think it's around 25, 22, 23 countries. It shows the year in which their inflation peaked and the highest inflation level that they hit. Mongolia is the last one here, at 321% inflation in 1992. Look at the other countries. There were the true shock therapy countries like Poland and some others, Estonia, Latvia. They had very high inflation. There were countries that would be considered more gradual reformers. Look at the inflation rates we're seeing here, over 1,000% in several of them. Then there are some that were very slow reformers. Let's just look at some here: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Look at Ukraine. In 1993, Ukraine's inflation was 4,000. The CPI increased to a level of 47 times higher than it had been the year before. These are not shock therapy countries. The point is there were shocks, inflation shocks in almost all these countries. And why there are a couple of exceptions is a subject for a different talk and not really very relevant here. In almost all of them, inflation shocks were very high. whether they were rapid reformers or gradual reformers or non-reformers. And the reason had to do with some structural issues when you transition from a planned to a market economy, which we could discuss in question and answer or on a separate talk. There is a similar pattern in trade liberalization, specifically the exchange rate. So the Tugrik was devalued sharply in January 1991, but the rate was not free. And there was a dual official and market rate system. Again, this is not a shock therapy situation. When I arrived in Mongolia that June, there was a market right across the street from the central bank where everyone knew you could go change your dollars and you could get 70, 80, over 100 tugriks later per dollar, whereas the official rate was much lower. This creates all sorts of strange incentives. People who have access to hard currency still at the official rate were able to make a lot of money through arbitrage. This is not a shock therapy. This is not even a real market economy. It wasn't until May 1993 that the exchange rate was unified. The second key reform was privatization. I'd like to save time, I'll go through this a little quickly, but happy to discuss. Their focus on two different aspects of the privatization program, which was developed by Dag Gambold and his group of market economists. There was this voucher, the mass voucher privatization, which took place, which was launched in 91, starting in June and July, and which was actually quite successful in terms of being implemented quickly. So over 4,500 small and large, which were really more like medium enterprises, were privatized under this voucher privatization. The Nigdals, the herder collectives, were also privatized. This is remarkable speed, but this was one part of privatization program. And the reason why it proceeded relatively smoothly is all in all, the shock from it was relatively small, as described here. I won't read all of these. But the point is that these voucher privatizations took place for smaller businesses quite smoothly. But when we think of shock therapy privatization, we generally think about cash privatization, about oligarchs emerging by buying up companies at bargain prices and then controlling them later. Cash privatization in Mongolia didn't even start until 1996. Well, with a few very, very small and really not very significant suggestions. So that was meant to start sooner, but it was postponed regularly by the Jasrai government. So the only big cash privatization that was attempted during those years was the Iktagor, the State Department store, but that got bogged down in a lot of scandal and it was not privatized. So the pattern in privatization was, in those first few years, the vouchers went ahead smoothly with relatively little trouble because it wasn't much of a shock. These companies were not, people did not take control of these companies and lay off lots of workers and so on. The cash privatizations that were more had bigger impact didn't really start until after the 1996 elections. I'll skip this one to save time. So the transition in Mongolia was more of a cyclical pattern of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 4 steps forward, and so on, and swinging back and forth. Gambasurin's government started a big bang, but quickly it slowed down. Jasrai government slowed reforms even further. It's not a criticism in any way, that this is was the outlook of the Just Right government. Price commissions stayed in place. Privatization almost stopped. Uh, Interestingly, you see this point here. Not only did the government not privatize any of the bigger enterprises in these years, they actually borrowed $60 million to build a new state-owned steel plant. Again, this is not a shock therapy pattern. And the Darhan metallurgical plant, of course, has been a source of a lot of controversy and trouble ever since then. Then only in 1996, the Democratic coalition took over and abolished price commissions. They moved reforms ahead very rapidly again, and they started the cash privatization program, which took quite some time to launch and then complete. They took a very strong step, abolishing import tariffs altogether in 1997. So rather than a shock therapy big bang in which everything happens in a short time, Mongolia swung back and forth in rapid reforms, then slowing down or even reversing, and then rapid reforms again, and then slowing down and even reversing. What was the role of the IFIs in all this? Well, as should be clear from what we've already seen, the most significant reforms took place in the fall of 1990 when the privatization program was designed and approved. In January 91, Resolution 20. These were before Mongolia had even joined the World Bank and IMF, let alone had programs with conditionalities that imposed anything. The first donors meeting was held in May 91 when the reforms were already well underway. And one thing which those of us who were here at that time remember so well, one of the huge, most pressing issues for the donors was the need to somehow keep the combined heat and power plants running after the withdrawal of Soviet bloc advisors, no longer having access to spare parts and equipment and fuel. This was this need to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe that would have occurred if these plants had broken down in the winter was paramount. The first IFI loans were only approved in October 1991, long after these major reforms had not only started, after they were already slowing down. So did the IFIs even then impose shock therapy? As we've seen, the timing already proves that this wasn't the case. Peter Boone's writings, Peter Boone, who worked closely with some of the more radical reformers, what he indicated was the reformers were hoping to use the IFIs to get their more radical reforms through, but the IFIs resisted. Gumboldt and his group would say we need to do this to please the IMF, for example, but the IMF resisted. And how do we know that? This is another really interesting slide, some important content. These are contemporary accounts from Hiroshi Ueno from Japan and from some key World Bank documents. Ueno's account of his discussions with IMF at that time said the IMF recalled that the government was more enthusiastic about the transition than the IMF. The government wanted these radical reforms. This quote is from an important World Bank paper co-authored by Javed Burki. Burki was the World Bank's chief for China and Mongolia at that time, the most senior World Bank person involved in Mongolia programs. Look what he wrote in 1991. Reforms are being introduced at a rate which far exceeds the absorptivity of an economy lacking even the most basic market institutions. The World Bank was not urging Mongolia reform as rapidly as possible. The World Bank was encouraging Mongolia to slow down, to take their time. And this is consistent with what I found in all those years, because I frequently joined government discussions with the IMF, with the IFIs, and it was often the case that the IFIs were urging slower and more gradual reforms. Of all the ones listed here, the last one is kind of interesting because occasionally you'll still see people saying that the IMF imposed the abolition of tariffs on the Mongolian government. But in fact, it was the opposite. In 1997, when the democratic government then decided to abolish tariffs, they needed the IMF's approval because it had a budget impact, and the IMF opposed it. The government had to convince the IMF that they could handle the budget impact before the IMF approved. It was purely a Mongolian initiative. So, what have we shown? Yes, there was a shock, but it was not caused by the IFIs or by the Western donors. The IFIs and Western donors came in as the shock was unfolding and tried to help solve it. To the extent that the reforms were ever radical, which was a very limited extent, that was a Mongolian initiative, not an IFI initiative. And in fact, the IFIs argued against radical reforms. So despite all this, why is this myth so enduring? Why do we see it so often? Okay. In some ways, it's understandable. In Central and Eastern Europe, they rose up against socialism because they were intensely aware of how rapidly they were falling behind Western Europe. Think of East Germany and West Germany. Think of Hungary. Think the people feeling we should be as prosperous and advanced as Austria. Think of Estonia and the Baltics. Estonia saw themselves as like Sweden or Finland or Denmark. We should be one of them. We should be a Nordic advanced economy, but instead they were being held back by socialism. So in these countries and in the USSR, the systems collapsed because of internal failures that led to internal uprisings in one way or another. In Mongolia, although of course there was a movement to end socialism, both political rule of the Communist Party and the planned economy, the real source of the transition and of the reforms that took place, of the problems that led to the reforms, was external changes. Mongolia had no choice. If the Soviet Union had continued providing money and hadn't collapsed, it's hard to say what would have happened, but there's certainly no reason to think that socialism would have collapsed so quickly in Mongolia. So in the Mongolian people's minds, and many of the ones who experienced that deeply traumatic time, unemployment, rationing, inflation, depreciation, they were associated with the new system. Although, in fact, the reason these problems were occurring was the impact of the collapse of the old system. There's also the China experience right next door. So some people, when they criticize shock therapy, they point to China as a model of what could have been done. But for the reasons listed here, which I won't read through to save time, I don't think China's experience is really relevant for Mongolia. It just emphasized the first and the last points. Mongolia started its transition in the face of this huge economic and social shock. China had nothing like that. China's reforms and introduction of market forces began as part of a huge economic boost that came from undoing Mao Zedong's very strange, very unfortunate economic policies that suppressed growth for many years. So as soon as China started its reforms, growth took off and incomes grew and poverty was reduced. Whereas in Mongolia, the reforms took place in the face of the opposite, a slowdown in growth and emergence of poverty. And of course, the last point is also critical. China's model is based on continued Communist Party rule, and this is not what Mongolia wanted. Some promotion of this myth is purely ideological. Some people who criticize the Mongolian so-called shock therapy basically say that any market-oriented reform is neoliberal shock therapy. So some of them, I've read essays, basically they say they're all shock therapy. MPRP, Democrats, Jusrai, Ankh Saihan, Ankh Bayer, all of those early prime ministers, they all worked with the IFIs. They all accepted the need to move to a market economy. Therefore, they're all shock therapists. But that's a really, really serious mistake and seriously unfair to those leaders and to the Mongolian people. Because the fact is, the critical policy choices that Mongolian governments faced at every step of the transition were addressed in different ways by different governments. There was a huge variation, as I've said, more rapid reforms, much slower reforms, privatization of state enterprises, borrowing $60 million to build a new state-owned enterprise. If you think all of these governments were shock therapy governments, then the term shock therapy has no real meaning. And this underlying worldview that somehow before 1990, Mongolia had Soviet masters, and after 1990, Mongolia exchanged them for IFI masters. This is not just incorrect. IFI's role is nothing like the role the Soviets played, but it also undermines the essential reality that Mongolia has a great deal of control over its own economy today and its own economic future. And it has exercised that control over the years through those variations and changes in approaches that I've just described. Lastly, the people who propagate this shock therapy myth also tend to present an exaggerated, gloomy picture of Mongolia's development. Mongolia is a disaster, and it's all the IFI's fault. Mongolia has so much poverty, and Mongolia has so much this, inequality, this and that, and so on. Healthcare, education collapsed. This is what these people say. But what is the reality? As Buyan mentioned, I worked for a long time for the UN, and I'm a deep believer in the Human Development Index, which was invented by the UN, by UNDP, with inputs from some brilliant people like Amartya Sen, as a way of measuring development that doesn't just focus on wealth, on incomes, but combines income as one factor with longevity, life expectancy, and with education enrollment rates. And it comes up with an index that captures all these aspects of development. And I'm going to look at a chart now that I just drew up last week based on the most recent data that UNDP has available of 28 transition economies. And read what we've got here. Among these 28 economies, Mongolia's improvement in percentage terms in the HDI since 1990 is the greatest of all of them, despite the size of that shock that Mongolia had to overcome. Let's look at these numbers because they really are quite amazing. Mongolia's HDI between 1990 and 2021, the most recent year for which data is available, the HDI increased by nearly 28%. more than any other of these transition economies. Look, Russia only increased by 12%. Look at so many. So whatever else you say about the choices that Mongolia made, to claim that Mongolia's development since 1990 has been a disaster is simply doesn't fit the reality that this index that captures life expectancy and education enrollment rates, along with income, has improved in Mongolia more than it has in any other transition economy during this period. So, just concluding, and I'll make this brief to save time again. Yes, there was a huge shock, but the shock occurred before the IFIs came in and before the donors came in, and it was a direct result of the collapse of massive support and that Mongolia had been receiving from the Soviet Union, and Mongolia's dependence on soft currency trade, which was no longer possible. The donors, including the IFIs, came in to try and help counter the shock. They didn't cause the shock. The most radical reforms were a Mongolian initiative, not IFI imposed. In fact, the IFIs have made clear in many ways that they in fact preferred a more gradual approach. And those radical reforms, the pattern came out over and over. The really radical reforms were often announced, but they were never implemented to any extent that would justify labeling them as shock therapy. And then finally, despite all that, whatever you think about the choices that were made, Mongolia's performance since 1990 has been impressive compared with other transition countries. So thank you. I have my email address here. I would welcome anyone who wants to send me an email about your experiences, your thoughts about any of these questions. Now I will stop sharing screen and I'll open for discussion, and I'm available to discuss and welcome questions and comments. So William, you're muted. How shall we proceed? I think there were some who wanted to raise their hands earlier during discussion, but I asked to hold off until now, but now I'm happy to answer questions or listen to your comments.
We had one question earlier in the talk. The question was, I would like to ask a question. How comparable is the Mongolian economic recession of 92-93 to the Great Depression? Many sources say the economy contracted by a third.
I think the key point is that Mongolian the economy contracted by more than a third. There are a lot of, okay. Let me just say it this way. What was very different about the Mongolian shock was how abrupt it was and how much damage occurred in such a short time compared to the Great Depression, which went up and down, but further and further down over an extended period of time. So there was no 2 or 3 year period during even the Great Depression that had nearly a comparable impact to the impact that the 2 to 3 worst years in Mongolia had. It's probably the most important one. It's hard sometimes to compare numbers from the pre-1990 days with numbers in the post-1990 days, simply because of the issue of pricing. How do you value things that were produced do you use the current prices and convert them by transferable ruble exchange rates from the 1980s? That to use methodology like that to assess how much of a shock took place is problematic. But again, what made this so different from the Great Depression was its combination of many factors: the loss of aid, the collapse of trade, and the fact that it all happened at once. Yes, I see a hand up.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to allow Adia. I think
you did.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. It's Adia. You may remember me. I used to work at UNDP project back in mid 90s. Was aimed to undertake the civil reforms as part of this whole kind of reform program. So it's more like an observation rather than question, Bill. I think today, after 30 years of this whole economic reforms, when Mongolia claimed the values of freedom of speech, democratic values, free enterprise, free market, and today, I think after 30 years, I think the country is still at the crossroad. So whether we have to reinforce these fundamental values again, once again reinforcing that the private sector drives the country's development. The private sector creates jobs, it pays taxes, it contributes to community development. Because you see, it's this American Chamber of Commerce, we see this situation where the country is a crossroad with it to stick to these values, fundamental values of free enterprise, free market, or maybe lean towards a more like state-owned capitalism, where there's a dominating role of the state. And as you rightly mentioned, there are so many SOEs. We're back at 1990s, and today there's still so many of them. They're working efficiently. There's a poor corporate governance, and the government is not intending to do the comprehensive reforms of SOEs because it's good for them, for rent seeking, for corruption. All this thing. I think so. Now today we still is a kind of crossroad, and like after 30 years, and that's kind of the more kind of observation and comment rather than question. Would be glad to hear your views on that, Bill.
I thank you, Adia. It's nice to hear your voice. I remember you very well. I guess my main reaction to that would be simply that for the topic of today's discussion, if people start from the idea that what happened during the reforms, that first few years of reforms, was all this disastrous mistakes that were pushed onto Mongolia by the IFIs, including private sector development, including privatization and other such reforms, then they will make they're likely to make mistakes in assessing the right choices that Mongolia needs to make today. But I don't want to comment on specific issues that Mongolia is facing today, because, as I said, the purpose of my talk today was not to judge which approach was right, which was wrong. Different people have different feelings. It was just to be clear about what happened, and also be clear that all in all, Mongolia has done well over these last 30 odd years, not poorly. But yes, perhaps one reason why Mongolia has done well, it seems quite possible to me, is that this pattern of some reforms, some people pushing reforms quickly and successfully, but then faltering, and then a period of slowing down and adjusting and internalizing the reforms, and then someone else coming in and picking up the pace again. Perhaps that has worked well. That has been Mongolia's pattern, and the outcomes have been reasonably good. Thank you for the question, Idea.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Having some technical issues on my side. But we have more questions to build. So this next question comes from Indirse Gundafe. How comparable is the Mongolian recession in the 1992 to 1993 to the Great Depression?
I think I answered that one already.
Oh, okay. So you answered that. Okay, so the next question is, what would Mongolia be like today if Mongolia went through the shock therapy as with Poland? Would our development be comparable to the successful post-communist countries?
Wow. That is a really hard question to answer. It's a very interesting one to discuss, maybe over a few beers or something. I guess I'm very sympathetic to the arguments made by people like Peter Morel, who I quoted a couple of times during the talk, who said that while in theory, very rapid reforms were the right approach to take, in fact, the capacity to implement rapid reforms really wasn't there. It's not that easy moving from plan to free prices. It's not a simple thing to suddenly privatize and tell companies, you're on your own, good luck, which in fact didn't happen. And I mean, because as I say, this was not a shock therapy situation, that the culture and the attitudes and the education that are needed to maintain a thriving market economy take time to develop. So I think Mongolia would be, if I had to say, I would say it took a bit longer than it needed to, but I wouldn't necessarily, perhaps a better approach in hindsight would have been slightly slower start to the reforms at the beginning, but then sustain them without large steps backwards along the way. Certainly, if you go back and look at that inflation chart that I shared, comparing the inflation records, for example, of different countries, looking at the different approaches they took, one pattern is the ones that reform prices and stuck to the reforms, even when they were painful, tended to get inflation under control quite quickly, whereas countries that like Mongolia, started with ambitious reforms, but then started tinkering, they tended to, high inflation tended to last for several years because the underlying forces weren't being addressed. I find it easier to think about about how Mongolia's economic future looks. And I don't think there's much question that the future, some strong steps to somehow do attract more private investment, including foreign investment, some steps to encourage small new Mongolian businesses as many have emerged, but encourage them even more and put conditions in place for free and fair competition rather than dominant market positions of a few large state-owned or private enterprises. I think all in all, those would probably be supportive of Mongolia's economic future. But it's a great question, and I would love to have an hour to think about it and to talk about it. Whoever asked it, got me a line, and the next time in Mongolia, I'll look you up.
So the question was from Mogi, and he has a
Mogi.
comment on your answer that he would be glad to have that beer with you and discuss
Mogi,
this
I
topic.
would like that. That sounds
And
good.
he asks a second question. There are a number of prominent intellectuals and financial experts who openly preach how West-enforced shock therapy ruined Mongolia. So is this an agenda, or are people buying into this sort of myth that is being propagated? What do you think
Or
of this?
both.
Or both?
Or both. Yes. Yeah, I mean, people who know me, I think most would agree that I have this deep, deep, deep respect for the Mongolian policy makers that I've worked with over the years, and for Mongolian people in general, the people my friends and people I've gotten to know so well, I mean, over the years. And that includes people who were more, at the policy level, the more reformist, radical ones, the Gambold and later Prime Minister Eng Saihan and others like them. And it includes people who were more cautious, and people like Prime Minister Jasrai, who I got to know fairly well as well when I worked under his government. I resent people who say that somehow it wasn't a Mongolian thing; it was all just forced on us. This is all the foreigners who pushed all of this on Mongolia and forced this on us. I do resent that, and I think it generally is people who have an agenda and like sort of nationalistic and divisive approaches, criticizing enemies and pointing at them like that. And they have their agenda, and then they can seize other people them, and that other people are credible enough to believe. But yeah, Mogi, you're asking so many good questions. Let's add that to our discussion over beer when I visit.
We have someone raising her hand, and she's giving her a video, so it's safe to take.
Yes.
Ask her to unmute.
Hello.
You're unmuted.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. I wanted to say that I noticed that in the literature there is a debate about the role of international financial institutions and whether it was the reformers or whether it was IFIs that were responsible for some of the more harmful reforms. And I think that your talk, and especially the record that you gave us on conditionalities that the IMF imposed, or lack thereof, basically, really cleared the record for me. This is also something that I had been wondering about and researching. So I wanted to say thank you, and yeah, it was a very useful, enlightening talk for me. And one reason why I think that this myth continues is because Mongolian people are very traumatized by the destruction of the factories and the industrialization Mongolian people say it took like 2 or 3 generations to build up the factories, and then transition to a market economy, like destroyed everything and then caused poverty and etc. So I think that, people like, as you say, they like blame neoliberalism very broadly and globally, but then there are very many nuances to it, and many different types of reforms, many different actors, many different events that happened. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's very true. I think that is why this myth is so attractive to people. It's understandable that they think that somehow they associate the pain and the trauma of the collapse with what followed, instead of seeing clearly who can blame them.
Mm-hmm.
That what actually first came the collapse, and if the reforms hadn't come in, things would not have been less painful. They just would have been worse. The IFIs at least poured in some of that hard currency that Mongolia needed so desperately.
Yeah.
One thing, as the record shows, I worked with the Just Rise government for several years, with Eng Saihan's government. I knew Gambo and the people around him quite well. The IMF worked with all of them. The IMF and the World Bank and the ADB, they weren't coming in and saying, if you want us to be here, you need to be radical reformers, pushing reforms as rapidly as possible. The IMF worked very well with the Just Rise government. They worked equally well with the Eng Saihan. They worked equally well with the Ankh-Bayer government. Well, when problems came up, it had nothing to do with the pace of reform and had to do with basic macro stabilization, macro targets. So the IMF, there's simply no basis, in fact, for the claim that the IFIs pushed radical reforms on Mongolia. It's simply
I believe that there's just a lot of like strong opinions that are kind of crowding the literature, but without so many references to facts.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And as you mentioned, Prime Minister Eng Saihan's government, we have a question that relates to that period of time. So were the free market reforms, or at least at the attempts of Prime Minister Eng Saihan between 1996 and 1998, were ultimately his demise and the cause of those reforms? What do you think?
No, I don't think that. I wouldn't say that. So, because that was basically internal squabbles within the Democratic coalition at that time. It seems to me that when Eng Saihan was replaced by Elbik Dorch, and then Elbik Dorch was replaced by Naran Satsral, and then Naran Satsral was replaced by Amar Jargal. In none of the cases did any of them say, I'm coming in because I have a specific objection to the policies that the predecessor had observed. The reason why they came in was different in each case. In some cases, it was problems, like Elbik Dorch encountered a problem with the bank sale, this reconstruction bank, and Naran Satsral had some other issues, but they basically were all coming from a similar place, and they all were following a similar reform agenda. Eng Saihan lasted longer in office than any of the others, and came in with more momentum and accomplished probably more than the others were able to, simply because of politics, not because of difference in overall attitudes. So that's my sense.
Hmm. We have a message for you from Himid, who says, "Hi, Bill. Nice to see you after a long time. It looks like someone who knows you. You see
Oh
the
my gosh, Chimit. You unmute yourself, Chimit.
I've
Chimit.
asked him to unmute himself, so he can now
Sorry, this
unmute.
one.
Okay.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Bill. After a long time. I remember in
Wow.
1992, in 1993.
Yeah.
What we are work, huh? Just I don't have question because we are work during the 92 and 93, after 98, yeah, until. Just I have one information. Mr. Dushin Togus, who is director of Economic Research Institute, as you know, Mr. Batmuk, who is working National Statistical Office, we wrote Mongolian economy last 30 years, but it says kind of the book,
Yeah.
but it's
Wow.
something.
I think you have your background blurred. That's why we can't see the cover of the
Yeah,
book.
that's how to show it.
Can you hold it like to your camera?
It's something wrong, eh?
Та нөгөө нэг
Maybe
аюугаа артлаа ингээд үрсгэр болгоцсон болохоор харагдахгүй.
Ah,
Okay, I think we figured it out. Одоо болох юм шиг.
mhm.
While you're doing it, Chimit, I'm just thinking how nice it would have been back then to imagine our speaking by Zoom like this from between America and Ulaanbaatar. Okay, now you're on Zoom. Now you have to unmute yourself again, Chimit. Yeah. Mongolian 30 years
Yes.
of Mongolian economic. Wow.
It's just for your information, others.
And you did this with Batmok?
Batmunk
Or-
and Mr. Dushintogus, who
Tufshin
is,
Togus and Batmok?
yeah, we are three, yeah.
Wow.
Just for
So
your
many
information.
memories. So
Yeah.
many memories of,
Yes.
yes. Thank
Still we
you.
have the, okay, maybe next time we will contact you, yeah?
I would love to.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, thank you.
It's great to see you.
Yes.
Okay, does anyone else have questions? Okay, so we received a couple of questions through email, and the first one reads, do you get much information about what's happening in Mongolia currently? And in your opinion, does current Mongolian policy lead towards better economic prosperity? So it's a very wide and general question.
Yes. I do try to keep up with what's going on in Mongolia. I still do some occasional consulting work on Mongolian economic issues. Obviously, I can't follow as closely as I did when I was living there. I think I want to be fair and I want to be a little bit diplomatic. I think some important steps have been taken in recent years. I think the development of infrastructure to allow easier export of Mongolia's mining products and the sort of a boom in exports of those products. I think those are essential steps. I think they are an important part of Mongolia's ability to reach a fairly prosperous level of development, way of life. But so I guess as we say, they're necessary, but far from sufficient. So, I mean, so you have to tap those mineral resources, but you have to do it with your eyes wide open to the risks that dependence on commodity exports like that create. And you have to take steps to mitigate those risks. So, and those risks are huge and they're cross-cutting ones. This famous resource curse, I believe deeply, is a real issue and a challenge. So I think very useful and important steps have been taken, but they're also the easier ones. The more challenging ones still lie ahead. Diversifying the economy, creating a more competitive economic system, as I touched on earlier, promoting the development of new private businesses in non-mineral, non-mining sectors, as would be the case, dealing with the governance issues, managing the resources, the inflow of money that comes from mining exports, dealing with the corruption that's frequently associated with a heavy dependence on commodity exports, especially mining exports. Those are all real challenges, and whoever is the prime minister after the coming election will have a lot to deal with.
Well, I think that's captures a lot of sentiment with people too. They want diversified economy, but there's a real lack of infrastructure, and especially this winter we've had scheduled blackouts in the city, certain areas of the city too. So also
again,
yeah,
yes.
Infrastructure. We have a question in the chat. DJ asks, Bill, you have been working in Mongolia, especially during early 90s, over 2000. What is your assessment on how the privatization and nulling of the import tariff impacted the deindustrialization and becoming an import dependency in Mongolia?
Yeah, I think the deindustrialization, that was to a large extent an unavoidable impact of the collapse of this soft currency denominated trade. So that early phase of deindustrialization, this first factories that, I mean, the factories were producing products and they no longer had markets to export them to, because East Germany was now able, suddenly the East German people could buy Western European goods, and the Poles and the Hungarians and all the others, and the Russians. And Mongolian, those factories were dependent on imports. They needed to be able to import fuel and equipment and parts, and they couldn't any longer because there's these transferable ruble arrangements. Those were no longer available. So that was inevitably going to be traumatic. And deindustrialization, to a large part, was the result of that. I think the privatization, I've never seen any indication that that really had a major impact on manufacturing output. Most of the privatizations that took place were among smaller firms, and many of them were facing trouble anyway. The import tariff, in the end, that my sense of that decision was that it was meant more than anything to catch the world's attention rather than to actually, rather than a focus on what specific economic impact it would have, which was small. So yeah, it made some imports a bit cheaper. Tariffs were not high to begin with. The main, but there was no indication of uh, Mongolian firms going out of business because suddenly imports due to that decision were so cheap that they could no longer sell their products. It really was more a matter of let's get the world's attention. And it succeeded in that. The world noticed that Mongolia was doing something dramatic. And that was around the time that Mongolia also, the government's sort of developing the new mining law and looking for ways to attract new investment into the mineral sector. So, this comparison with China, that's such a huge difference between China and Mongolia. China, the whole world knew about China, this huge market, these beautiful ports along the coast, Shanghai and Xiamen and Guangzhou and Tianjin. I mean, the world was eager to get into China. The world was not eager to get into Mongolia, the businesses around the world when the transition started. Mongolia needed to actively seek them out. So I wouldn't say that deindustrialization was something that resulted from the reform policies that took place, nor was it stopped and turned around by the slowing of reforms under the MPRP governments, Mr. Jasrai and Mr. Enkbayer later.
And it is interesting to see that even now, even like on social media and just conversing in public, you see a lot of people say that, Mongolia used to produce millions of pairs of shoes, or we used to have light manufacturing. We used to make these and that. We imported that. We exported them to Poland and East Germany. So essentially, they were outcompeted by Western companies in those export markets.
Yes. And just, I love, as I prepared for this talk, this whole soft currency and hard currency concept. I mean, it's really, I hope most young Mongolians have no idea what that even means. I mean, have probably, I hope, never even heard those terms but everybody was aware of them back then. Dollars were hard currency. I mean, you could buy so many things with hard currency that you couldn't buy with soft currency. I mean, and they were two totally different things. Yeah. I mean, I can understand. Look, there are people in the U.S. now, and I don't want to get caught up in U.S. politics, but it's also the case, totally different reasons, but this nostalgia for what, this era where people think everything was wonderful, and U.S. was the world's leading manufacturer of all kinds of products. Ford and General Motors were the world's most famous auto companies, and Coca-Cola and so many things. And well, Coca-Cola maybe still is, but and that kind of nostalgia for the past without understanding what were the underlying factors that drove trends, then what made them possible, what stopped them if they did stop. that's more difficult. And the tendency to blame foreigners, blame other people for all your problems is it's such a natural one, but it's a really pernicious one.
Sort of makes it easy to divert bad decision, like taking responsibility. But I think we've run for about 90 minutes. Usually we run for 1 hour. And thank you for staying with us through this, Bill, and of course the audience.